welcome back to the React In-Depth series. In this video, we're going to go over a topic called conditional rendering in React together. Conditional rendering is a way for us to, as the name kind of implies, return different things conditionally depending on a condition. So if you've studied JavaScript and used it before, you're probably familiar with this idea of conditionals, things like if-else statements and even switch statements, and you can use them in loops, you can use them outside of loops. There's all sorts of places to use these conditions, and there's also these shortcuts with the conditionals, like the logical operators. So if all that seems new to you, I definitely encourage you to check out just basic conditional statements in JavaScript, and there's a video on a channel to learn about that. But what we're going to see in this video is how that applies directly to rendering components in React and the extra superpowers that allows us to do once we have this knowledge behind us. So let's take a look at some theory and then some examples in code together. Okay, so to start, I just want to kind of define what this idea of conditional rendering is, just so that we're all on the same page, kind of a bit beyond what I just mentioned. So it really is this idea of, within React, the ability to control what kind of JSX we're returning. And recall that JSX is just kind of React's way to explain what shows on the DOM, and it renders it out to the DOM as actual DOM nodes, like things like p tags and divs and inputs and things like that. So we can conditionally tell React to render like one thing or another thing, depending on what happens inside of that component logic-wise, which is really, really nice. Very similar to how we would use conditionals inside our regular JavaScript code to kind of go one way and down a path or another way down a path, or have multiple different paths to choose from. So we're going to be seeing this using regular JavaScript conditionals, as I mentioned, things like if-else statements, the switch, ternary operators, and some of the logical operators that we'll see shortly. And really, at the end of the day, this allows us to have a very, very versatile way to build our components so that we can actually do some pretty cool things, and it's going to be quite necessary. And I'll show you some use cases later as to where this might actually become useful, but definitely something that we're going to be using pretty much all the time in almost all of our components. So let's just get started with this idea to start of just conditionals by recapping the idea of what a conditional even is. And that is really this idea of having something that allows us to conditionally do something in the code. And a condition means there's some thing that we are kind of checking. For example, it could be something as basic as a true or false value, but it could be even more complicated. Like, for example, it could be a number less than or greater than something. It could be that a string is equal to some value, and things like that. So we have some condition. And then that condition is going to basically unlock different paths in our code. So traditionally, we would see this with if-else statements or else-if statements. We've even seen a bit more advanced use cases with switch statements before. And then the really fancy, fun ones that you definitely see a lot in React, and I'll cover this shortly, is these ones down here, which is the idea of the ternary operator, which is really just a shortcut for if and else. And else if, technically, if you get really fancy and you nest these, which I don't really advise you to do too far. And then the idea of the logical operators, which are the like the and, the or, and then the nullish coalescing operator. So let's start with the most fundamental one, and then we'll look at some code together as well, just to really make sure that this hammers in. So here's a component. And in this component, I have a Boolean value declared at the top. This is nothing fancy. There's no state. It's just a static value inside the scope of this actual component. And it's set to be true pretty much 100% of the time, no matter what, always in this component. And this component is saying, if test, return true, otherwise return false. I just realized that this is actually the other way around. Look at that. I don't even know how to do a basic conditional. There we go. So if test is true, we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to return false. Hopefully you caught that. I'm surprised that I made that mistake there. I always get confused, I guess, with my conditional statements. But there you have it, right? So we're saying if true, return this JSX here, otherwise return this JSX down here. And you can see I actually got rid of the else statement, because since I have a return inside of this function here, no matter what happens, everything down here past the if statement is kind of implied to be the else or the falsy value in this case. So you'll usually see it like this, just to shorten this so we don't have too nested of our code. But if you really feel more comfortable, you can also put an else down there just so it's a bit explicit. So this is saying if true, return a paragraph tag that has the value true in it. Otherwise, return the paragraph tag that has the value false in it. So this is quite nice, right? And this might seem a bit strange, but I want you to rethink back to when we first kind of learned React together. All these components in React are just functions. They're just functions at the end of the day. So in a function, like if I showed you this function, ignore the JSX for a second. Imagine that this is just returning a string true or a string false instead of a p tag. This is just a regular JavaScript function. There's nothing fancy about this at all. It has nothing to do with React, nothing to do with anything beyond just regular JavaScript. So here we have a function keyword is defining a Boolean value up here. We're doing a conditional test on that Boolean value, and then we're returning something based on if it's true and something based on if it's false. The only thing that React is doing in this case, for this example at least, is we're sprinkling some JSX in there, which is just creating the DOM nodes in a nice, simpler syntax. Technically, if we built this in the actual DOM API without React, we could actually just return like a create element P and a create element P here for false and true, with the text content being different, and that would be the exact same thing. Okay, so let me just build this up really quick so we have some examples to work through in my editor, and then we'll kind of ramp it up as we go. So I'm going to create a new project here. I'm just going to do npm create vite at latest, like I always do for my React projects here. I'll just call this conditional rendering, and I'll use React and I'll use JavaScript, and I'm going to change to conditional rendering there, and I'll run npm install. And while that's installing, I will open up my source here, and then I'll open up my main.jsx. I don't really want this styling here, so I'll just get rid of that. I'm also probably not going to use the app here. So what I'll do is in my source folder, I'll just create a new file. I'll just start with an if .jsx. I'll just go with that. I'll do function if, and I will say export default if, and I will do here const my Boolean value, and I'll set this to be true. If the Boolean value, then I want to, I'll do this explicitly here, return let's do an H1 just to make it different, true. And then otherwise here, so this is where I mentioned we can either do a return or directly, or we can just do the else. I'll say an H1 here, and I will say false. Okay, and inside my main.jsx, I'll just import that over here. I'll run npm run dev here on the side. Make sure that actually starts up. I'll grab that URL. I'll go over to Chrome. I'll paste that in, zoom in a whole bunch there, and I'll open up my console as well, just so that we can take a look at that if we need it later. And I'll switch back to VS Code. I'll get rid of this app. Also hide this here, and I'll import my if from if.jsx. What a short component name. That's a fun one. And I'll put if here, and if I switch back to Chrome, what we should see is true. Okay, and that's going to be our H1 right there. I'll zoom in even more there just so that we can see that a bit more clear. Okay, so that's my H1 of true. And as you would imagine, if I change this to be false, right, like that, then I would have false showing up, right? So we are changing what this H1 is depending on a Boolean value right here. Okay, so hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at the switch statement. You won't see this as much, but there are cases where this is definitely quite useful. So here we're creating a switch function where it's the same thing. We have a conditional value that we're switching on. We can switch on that, enumerate the cases out, and have a default. And then in this case, you can see that we don't match case 1, so we're not going to return that. We do match case 2, so we're going to return a p tag with 2 in it. And if we didn't have any of that, we'll return the error. So I'll do the same thing here. I'll just create another file here. I'll call this switch.jsx. I'll do function switch just so we can see some examples. Because it is an interesting one. Export, typing too fast here. Default switch. There we go. And I'll just say const. I'll just say condition is equal to, let's just say 3, or actually, you know what I'll do? I'll do apple. There we go. And I'll do switch. And in this case, I'm switching on the condition. And since this is a string, I'm going to be enumerating out different string values or a default, especially for strings. You're going to want to make sure that you have the default value. So I'll always put that. And default, I'll just put, for example, error, something bad happened in this case. And I want to make sure that I return this. So usually what you want to do is probably have a scope here for each of these, just like that. But I'll just keep it simple for now. And for the other ones, you can kind of see how that would work. And for this, let's just say if the case is high, then we're going to return a p tag that says hi. If the case is Apple, I'm going to return a p tag that, can I do an emoji in here? Let's see, Apple. There we go. Let's do that. Why not? See if that works. Apple. And there we go. My reformatter just kicked in. So that should be good. So in this case, what we have is a string value that we're switching on. And it's not going to match this case. So we're not going to see that JSX return. It is going to match this case. We're going to see a p tag with the Apple emoji inside it. If we don't have anything in there, then we expect to see the error. So I'm going to import that in my main here. And I'll just say switch from switch.jsx. And I will put my switch right there. Perfect. So if we come back here, we will see our Apple emoji there, very small emoji, but there it is. And that's showing up inside of our p tag. And as you would imagine, if I was to change this string, right? Let's say I do change it to hi and I save that. You would expect to see hi show up, which we do. And if I switch it to anything else like banana, we would expect to see the default here, which is that we get an error returned back. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, right? Like you can kind of trace the flow of how this code is working and the relevant JSX that gets returned. Right now, we're not using state, and I'll give you an example with state shortly. But you can hopefully see that this really is at its core what conditional rendering is all about. We are controlling what kind of JSX we are returning depending on some condition, right? Whether that's state or not doesn't really matter in this case, but we're going to be conditionally rendering our JSX, hence the name of this video. All right, so that's a switch statement. Let's take a look at the ternary here. So ternary is very, very similar to the true and false for the if statement, right? So we have test equals true here. We're saying is test true, which is this case right here. And this is just a short form of if and else. If you haven't seen this before, I have a video on the ternary operator in the JavaScript series. You can take a look at that, or just check it out on MDN, the documentation. Just type in like MDN ternary or JavaScript ternary, and you should be able to see a couple quick examples. And then we can conditionally render this very nice syntax right here, where we can do one thing or the other. Now, I would advise not to switch or have too many conditions here. What you'll sometimes see is kind of like a nested ternary. I actually get really confused reading those, and I'm sure many people do. It's actually even this is quite concise. I wouldn't want to go much deeper than this, and it really depends on you and your team and how you feel about this. If you do have more nesting than even just this basic ternary, just like you would in regular JavaScript, I would encourage you just to actually enumerate it out using like a regular if else chain or even a switch if you need to. Okay, so this is just a shortcut for this, right? These are basically the same thing. This is just a shorter version of doing this, as you can see. And there are cases where you'll see this happen quite a lot. I won't go through an example because hopefully that kind of makes sense. This is just this exact same thing that we just saw earlier. Now, another one that you'll see a lot is these logical operators, okay? So let's go through these one at a time, and as well as I have a video on these logical operators as well if you haven't seen these before, but you can also just check the logical operators on Google, search for MDN JavaScript logical operators, and you can kind of look through some examples of these. But here we have the logical and, right, which is this ampersand ampersand. We're saying if test, well, I guess the way that this works is it's saying if test is truthy, then return this second value. Right? Because we're going to evaluate the result of this is going to be kind of this second value being rendered out. If this is the logical or is in this case over here. We're going to say if this is truthy, we want to return this if this is truthy. So let me just kind of go through this here, because I'm actually doing a really poor job of explaining this. Let me just go back to my source here, and I'll just create a logical.jsx, and I'll do a functional logical, and here I'll export default. I just realized I said like the same thing for both of those, which doesn't actually make much sense. And here what I want to do is I'll say const, I guess condition equals true. And I want to say return, so if condition ampersand, and then I'll say, I'll do an H1 here, and I'll say, well, I guess I'll just put anything in here. I'll just say hello. Doesn't actually matter. It doesn't have to be truthy in this, or true in this case, the text inside. So that's pretty much it for logical. Let me switch over to main, and I'll do, this is probably the most complicated one to explain. I hope I can do it justice here. Logical.jsx. Wow, I'm really butchering my typing here today. There we go. And then here is logical. Okay, so what we'll see is hello being rendered out to the screen. Okay, so that is because if I come back to my logical here, we have true. So what this is actually doing is, let me write this out here. We're doing true and in this case our H1. I'll just abbreviate it as that. So if this first condition is true, what we're going to be doing is we then need to evaluate the second condition. Okay, so what's going to happen in this case is the second condition is going to get evaluated and returned. Okay, so let me show you what I mean really quick. If I come to my console, let me zoom in a whole bunch. Oop, not too much there. And I say, let's just say 2, or I'll say true, and then I'll do high. What you'll see is I'll get high, the value high back. Okay, if I say false and high, what you'll see is I get false back. Okay, so with the ampersand operator, if the first value is truthy, then we're going to evaluate and return the second value. If the first operator is falsy, we're not even going to bother returning the second operator. So what's going to happen is if I change this to be false, we're going to be returning basically false here, and we're going to get nothing showing up in the DOM at all because we're returning false. Okay, which is basically doing this, is we're returning false. We're not returning anything inside of here, very similar to returning undefined. Okay, so very handy shortcut here. It's a bit confusing to kind of rationale about, but or reason about, I should say. But try these steps in your terminal to make sure it makes sense to you. We're returning the JSX here is evaluating on the right side for us instead of a string like this example, but that's exactly what's happening here. We're evaluating this JSX depending on what's the condition for true or false here. So let's look at the second example. I actually think I made a mistake here. I think this is actually going to evaluate to this one right there, test, which is why these are confusing. You should be careful with these every single time. And this one is true as well. I think I had them as false initially. It's probably what the mistake I made. So I'll show you why I'm moving them around in a second. So for logical OR, this is the double pipe sign. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to check to see if the first is truthy. If it's truthy, it's going to return that value right away. That's kind of the difference here. Okay, if it's falsy, it's going to check the second value and then return that. So what's going to happen here is let me change this to, so I'll comment that one out here, and I'll say return condition or and then I'll say h1 hello or. Let's go with that. Why not? And I'll start it as true. So if we come back, what we will see is we get nothing displayed to the console, or in React is rendering nothing. And the reason is we're basically doing this. So hopefully this fits on here. We're doing true or, and then if I do high, I'll just go with that. Well, we get true back, right? Because we don't need to check the second operand in this case, in this case the high, the string high, because no matter what this second value is in an OR statement, the first value is always true, if it's true, right? It's just there's no way it can be false if this is already true and we have an OR. Okay, because if you look at the truth tables, that true and anything is always true. But if I have a false or high in this case, we do have to evaluate and return the second result, or the second value in this case. So with the false, you can see how this is kind of slightly different than what we have up here with the ampersand, where if it's false, then we're going to go ahead and evaluate this second value and return that. Okay, so if I change this to be false, now what I expect to see is that I'm going to evaluate this h1 and return that, because I need to test to see that there's still a chance that this whole thing could end up being true, and we evaluate to the second value in this case. So we do get the hello OR in that case. Okay, so it's kind of like flipped and reversed, and it does take some kind of reasoning about to make sure that you're doing the right thing, but that is one potential shortcut you can use. The last one I want to show you is the most confusing one probably, which is the Nullish coalescing operator. So that is this one right here. With the double question mark. So we did look at this one before. Honestly, this one always ends up confusing me. There are some cases where you really do want to use this, and especially in like a backend development, in future series, we'll see some examples of that. But let me kind of just show you what this actually is, and I'll spell it out so that you can actually look at some examples and test this out on your own. So I'll switch back to Google here, and I'll do Nullish coalescing. And that's going to take me to MDN, hopefully, for JavaScript. You can add JavaScript if you don't just see this one here. And Nullish coalescing operator is this double question mark. This is relatively new in JavaScript. The main difference between this one and the pipe, which is the OR, is that it returns the right-hand operand when its left-hand operand, which is the left-hand side, is null or undefined. Okay, otherwise it returns the left-hand side. So this pretty much is a way to test for explicitly null and undefined, which are kind of the absence of values in JavaScript, including the Boolean values. So technically what I probably should have done to keep these a bit more, I want to keep these consistent, but I'll show you that if we did this as null or undefined, then we would get the true here in this case. But in this case, it's actually going to return true, the value true, which is going to show nothing to the screen. So let me show you what I mean here. So we're going to say, return condition question mark, which is the coalescing operator, and then we're going to say h1, and I'll say hello, and I'll do nullish coalescing. I think I spelled that right. It's a fancy word. So what we're saying is test this for null or undefined. If it is anything other than null or undefined, return this value. In this case, it is false, so we're going to return we're going to return false, which is going to show nothing to the screen. If it's null or undefined, then check this and return that. Okay, so in this case, let me even just go back to true, just so we can see that both of these values are not going to return anything. So if I switch back to here, we'll see nothing is on the screen. Okay, and if I switch this to false, and I switch back here, still nothing is on the screen. Okay, so let me clear this terminal here, and I'll show you. So if I do true coalescing of high, I'll see true. If I say false coalescing of high, I'll see false, which is what we saw earlier. True and false is what's being returned because we're only testing for null or undefined here. But check this out. If I say null coalescing with high, I will get high. And if I say undefined coalescing with any value, it doesn't have to be high, I can say like 3, I will get that second value. Okay, so this is a explicit way to test only for these two values in JavaScript. And there are many cases where we do want to test that, where other values might actually be considered valid. So for example, let me show you a very common one. If I say 0 ? And I do moo, I will get back the value 0, because 0 in this case is technically not falsy. But if I do 0 or moo, I will actually get back moo, because 0 is considered a falsy value. Same thing if I do 0 and moo, in this case, I will get back 0, but because 0 is considered falsy. Okay, so you got to be a bit careful with this, and there's many cases where we would want to test this, and the main ones are, or use this, sorry, the main ones are cases like this, where a 0 might be a valid value, and we don't want to just assume that it's falsy. I believe there's like empty string is another one, and there's a few falsy values by default in JavaScript, and sometimes you don't want that, so you want to make sure you are using this type of operator. So if I switch back here and I maybe made this undefined, for example, or null, we would actually see our h1 show up on the screen, which is quite nice. All right, you can see right there, you definitely need some practice with these ones. You will see probably this one the most. These other two you'll see with logic within the actual functions a little bit more, depending on kind of what type of app you're building. You will see ternary probably the most as all of these shortcuts. And then you will see if else quite a bit as well. So let's look at an example of where this is actually useful before I actually show you some more practical use cases and then some exercises in the next video together. So I'll create a new file here, and I will just call this inputs.jsx. And I'll just create a function here. I'll call this inputs. And I'm going to show you something that's you're going to use state to conditionally render something. So I'm going to import use state. So this is a hook that we looked at previously. And I'll const, I will call this input state set input, very creative name, state equals to use state. And then I'll just start an empty string for now. And what I'll do in here is I'll return 3 input tags. And the type is going to be a radio button. All right, the radio button, let me see if I can render this out to the screen really quick. I'll do export default inputs. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted, inputs. There we go. And I'm going to import that into main inputs from inputs.jsx. And if I put inputs here and then I switch to Chrome, what we should see is our 3 different radio buttons, right? So in this case, I can check all 3 of them because I haven't given them a grouping name yet, but that's totally fine. So let's do that right now, and we'll fix that. So let's make this name. I'll just call this demo. Name is demo. This would be the group name for these. So the type of value. So for example, it might be like age, or it might be like event or something like that, depending on what type of radio you're asking the user for, what type of input you're asking for. And then I'll give this a value of, let's just do a string of meow. And then I will do a value of, you can do this directly like this, woof, and a value of, let's just go. These are the same thing. In this particular example, these are the same thing. So now these are all part of the same group, and the value, each of these has their own value. So if I come back in here and I reload, I should be able to toggle between each of these 3 separately. I should probably give these a label each, so that it actually shows properly. So let me just do this. I'll just say label HTML4 is equal to, I should give these an ID. ID equals, just so that we can see this demo a little bit nicer. We'll just call this input meow, and this is input woof, and this is input rar. This is for meow, and then I'll just say meow. And I'll just copy this for, I believe the label. I always mix up the label here. You know what? I'll just copy this for now. I'll just go super basic. 1, 2, and 3. Woof is this one, and I got to make sure this is input woof, and this is input rar, and this is saying rar. Okay, so if I switch back here, we see meow, woof, rar. Right, pretty pretty nice. So I think technically we should probably like take this and kind of nest it. I always forget the formatting for these. Like technically, I guess that's more correct, where we kind of have it kind of like this, where it's kind of nested just for screen readers and some other things. But I believe the for should be pretty much good enough. So I'll leave it up to you, whichever way you prefer to have the labels or the inputs nested. I'll leave both on here just so we can see how that works. Now, the interesting thing here is we need to hook this up to state, and I want to show you how to conditionally render something depending on what's coming out here. So I'm going to say a function, and I'll just say handle. I'll just say handle click. I'm going to get an event, and I'm going to do something with that event. Now, each of these inputs is going to have, this is going to get quite messy, and on click, it's going to be handle click. There we go. And I'll just copy that for each of these inputs, and it's going to do a lot of shifting here, so I apologize. Let me reformat that really quick just so we can see. So I just put an on click onto each of these input tags, and this one is nested in this label, but the other ones are outside the label, right? So we have input here, handle click is the on click, and then handle click is the on click here. So just to test that this works, I'm going to console.log e.target.value, which is the value of that input. And we can see as I click these different inputs, I'm going to get the actual value logged out. So what I then want to do is I want to set input state to be e.target.value. Okay. And now this input state is going to be one of 3 values depending on what's kind of being rendered to the screen. Or it's going to start off with nothing. So let me show you kind of something pretty cool that we can do here. And there's many different ways to do this. We could either do this as separate components, which is probably the preferred way to do this, but I'm going to show you one potential way that you can do this. And there are many different ways, which we'll see in the exercises. So I'm going to say function, I'll say render pop-up. And this is going to take the input state, and depending on the input state, we're going to show a different pop-up. So I'm going to switch on the input state. And again, this is a function inside this input function. Okay, so we can return something from this function and use it anywhere else in our application or in this component. So I'll do case of, what was it? I think I had, was it capital letters, meow, woof, and rar. So the possible values are meow, woof, and rar. Okay, case of meow, I'm going to return an h1, and for meow, I will put a cat in there. There we go, cat. And for case of woof, I will return an h1, and I will put a dog. Let's go with dog. And a case of rar, what would rar be? I guess like a tiger? Tiger? Yeah, let's go with, is that a tiger? Is this a tiger? Is that a tiger? Yeah, that is a tiger. Oh, I like its whiskers. That's pretty cute. And if nothing, oh my gosh, what is that? Default will be, let's just return nothing. So we'll just return null. Okay. So there we go. So we have a function that's going to, depending on the input state, it's going to render out one of these to the wherever we end up using this render pop-up. So I'll show you something interesting. I'm going to actually take this function, render pop-up, and I'm going to put it at the very bottom. I'm going to call that function render pop-up. And this is basically the same thing as taking this and copying and pasting it there as if it's all in there, as if it's kind of all within the JSX. However, we can't really do that because we can only have expressions in the JSX, and this is a very large expression in this case. So we'd want to probably extract it out to a function. Probably better to put this as a separate component, to be completely honest, but we'll see that in the exercises. I just want to show you a simpler example to start. And what's going to happen here is when you change each of these values, we're going to be changing input state. Input state is going to cause this entire function to re-render with that new input state. So it's going to change from an empty string to, for example, meow or woof or rar. And then once it's those values, we are going to come down to JSX, execute all this, render out our labels and our inputs. React is going to see this. It's going to execute this function and expect some JSX to be returned, or things like undefined, null, or strings. And indeed, it's going to come in here, execute this. Input state is going to be that updated stateful value because we're using use state. And we're going to return one of these 3 or null for the first render, depending on what we see. So let's see how this works. If I come back here, I'll refresh the page and we see that nothing is checked. So we don't see anything on the screen. And I'll leave this open so we can see what happens here. I'll click on meow. And oh my gosh, nothing happens. That was so anticlimactic. I must have made an error here. What did I say? e.target.value. Did I not do this correctly? You're probably all being like, oh, I see it, Nader. I see what it is. Oh, it's lowercase. Lowercase. Look at that. So I didn't. It's the value that I have right here. So these are lowercase values. Oh my gosh. I can either change these or I can change the switch statements. It's always fun to see these errors, so I'll leave that one in. You can laugh at my anticlimacticness of all that. So let me refresh this page. I'll click on meow, and there we go. So we get my beautiful cat, and you see that it did pop up into the DOM right here. I'll click on woof, and you'll see that now we only see the dog pop up. The actual cat disappeared. It got removed from the DOM, and we have a totally new element in that place. And for rar, we see our tiger. Oh wow, it looks so different in this case. I wonder why it looks different in VS Code. It's so different in every single spot. It's cute. It even looks different over here. Yeah, we are returning something different. In this case, using a stateful value depending on what that state is. And in this particular example, this state is changing from use state, which is coming from this handle click where we're doing set input state that triggers every single time we click one of these buttons, right? It's going to call the onClick handler, and we're calling set state there. We know that set state is going to change that state and then re-render that component. So this component is going to re-render. We're going to come down to JSX. All of this is fine and dandy. The only thing that really changing is the input kind of toggle of the button. But then we also have this code executing down here that's going to return some JSX. Probably better, like I said, to have this as a separate component, but you can also do it here if you want to be a bit quicker and dirty about it. So here we're rendering a pop-up, which is going to execute this function right here that we just wrote, which is going to use a switch on that stateful value. And depending on that stateful value, it's going to return a totally different JSX. Okay, and if nothing is in there to start, we're going to return null, which means don't render anything in this spot. Okay, so hopefully that one makes sense and you found that one fun. I just want to show you, now that you've seen that, a couple of use cases to wrap up this video so you can kind of put your mind in the right place as to where this would be useful beyond kind of a toy example of toggling between these components. So one that we'll see in the next set of videos after the exercises is data loading. So if you imagine when you're loading data, for example, if I want to reach out to an API or a server somewhere, that information doesn't come back to me instantly, right? I need to wait some amount of time, maybe a few milliseconds or like a second or two. During that time, we actually want to be able to show something to our users. I want to say, hey, the data is loading. Please just wait a little spinner or maybe a percentage bar or something, right? So in our component, we could say, if the data hasn't come back yet, please show this component that's like a loading component. But once the data comes back, just like we had our set state, set the state to be something else so something else gets rendered to the screen, which is the actual data being displayed. Okay. Another thing that's really awesome is being able to toggle components, which is what we just saw. For example, a modal or a dialogue or something like that, or something more sophisticated. You can also get fancy and have like authenticated views. For example, if you're logged in, you can see one thing. If you're not logged in, you can see other things. We can have responsive views. So for example, in this case, a condition would be the device that you're using. If I'm on mobile, I want to render one thing. If I'm on desktop, it's something else. If I'm on tablet, something entirely different. There are so many different use cases for this idea of conditional rendering, and it's going to start popping up more and more in the different components, especially as you start making things a bit more robust and ready for the real world to be used by yourself in the future. And reusable components and even like custom hooks, as we'll see in the future, are all going to be using this idea of conditional rendering. So I hope you found this video useful and valuable and fun. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I have a Patreon set up as well if you want to support the channel that way, or on YouTube memberships, or by super thanks. What we're going to do in the next video together is go over a bunch of exercises to get more practice with this idea, so you can see different versions of using conditional rendering and how you can incorporate those into your applications. And then we will follow that up with data fetching, just so that we can actually see how we can actually start doing things like this idea of data loading with conditional rendering and some other really, really fun stuff. So I can't wait to get to those exercises. I will see you over there. See you later.